Dear friends, dear researchers, dear colleagues, welcome to the Dutch Institute in Florence. My name is Gert-Jan van der Smoon. I'm a senior researcher and I have the privilege of introducing today Tania De Nile. I'll give a brief introduction and then of course yours. Tania De Nile teaches Dutch and Flemish art history at the University of Rome, Tor Vergata, and she works as art historian in the Capitoline Superintendency for Cultural Heritage in Rome. Previously, she was adjunct professor at Roma Tre University and the University of Calabria, where she was a postdoctoral researcher with a project on Flemish and Dutch painters in southern Italy. A project that was funded by the European Union in collaboration with the RKD in The Hague. This project led to the organization of the international conference Fiamminghi al Sud, Oltre Napoli, at the Dutch Institute in Rome. The proceedings of this conference, co-edited by Tania, Arno Witte and Giovanna Capitelli, have just been published by Edizioni Quasar. And I'll show you the book because it's a very beautiful publication, published just 1 or 2 months ago. But in 2013, she defended her PhD thesis at Leiden University, which focused on the genre of spokerijen in the 17th century art market. I had the privilege of being her main supervisor, and thus being able to experience the genesis and the development of this major study up close. The revised and extended version of her thesis appeared last year as a monograph with the title Fantasmagorie, streghe, demoni e tentazioni nell'arte fiamminga e olandese. And here we have the book. It's published by Officina Libraria, beautifully illustrated. And another thing I should mention is that the publication was made possible with the financial support of the Verbus Foundation in Antwerp, who often supports research projects, especially on Flemish art. Tania also published several scholarly articles on the artistic relations between Italy and the Low Countries, including essays on Jacob van Zwanenburg, Belisario Corenzio, Salvator Rosa, and Dominicus van Wijnen. Of specific interest is a recent publication, but often neglected, on the Bentveugels, published in Studi di Storia dell'Arte, in I nomi della band, un'aggiunta all'elenco dei Bentveugels, because she discovered a drawing which on the verso has a list of names and nicknames of the Bentveugels. And of course, we do not have that much information on the band, so this was a most welcome addition to our knowledge on this particular group of painters, Dutch painters, northern painters working in Rome. This isn't an official book presentation because I asked her to deliver a lecture, but I think it's useful to briefly summarize the contents of her book, which gives a kind of context also for all those who are present here, and of course not to forget all those who attend us online. A warm welcome also to all those who follow the lecture online. The book is, of course, as you can tell also from the subtitle, it's on images of witches, demons, and evil temptations, especially in the art of the Low Countries of the 17th century. In the Netherlands, we had a kind of specific word for this type of imagery, spokerijen. And of course, the pioneers of these fantastic devilish images and scenes were Hieronymus Bos and Pieter Bruegel. And there have been a lot of studies on Hieronymus Bos and a lot of studies on Pieter Bruegel, but of course, Tania, she looks beyond Bos and Bruegel, the pioneers in this genre, and she tries to analyze everything that came afterwards. When indeed this type of imagery grew into a proper genre, that of the spokerijen. The second chapter of her book offers an analysis of the written evidence, the written sources. So on the one hand, of course, the treatises written by people such as Van Mander, Franciscus Junius, Samuel van Hoogstraat, and what you very often see, especially when it comes to people like Franciscus Junius, they weren't that enthusiastic about the images that were produced that were products of the pure imagination. They were pretty critical about monstrous images. But on the other hand, we see that when it comes to the history of collecting, and we start looking at the inventories, 17th century inventories, both from the southern and from the northern Netherlands, as well as, of course, sales catalogs, that this genre was pretty popular, both in the north and in the south. And this is, of course, remarkable, and this is something you much reflect upon, also pointing out the differences between what happened in the southern Netherlands and what happened in the northern Netherlands, because especially in the northern Netherlands, of course, we see that the religious connotations gradually kind of disappear. And there's a difference there. There's also an important chapter on the role of prints in the diffusion of this kind of imagery, and this already starts actually with prints by Schongauer, and then of course a very important examples such as the ones produced by Callot. But the longest chapter, and I find the most engaging chapter, is the 5th, which demonstrates that there were several artists who were kind of specialized in this particular subgenre. And often, for instance, think of Jan Breugel, the elder. Often these works are among his most spectacular paintings. And the same goes for Jacob van Zwanenburg. Jan Breugel, he worked, of course, for a long time in Italy, both in Rome and in Milan. Jacob van Zwanenburg, you will talk about him today. He worked for most of the time in Naples, and at the same time in Leiden, in the circle of Leiden University, we have Jacques de Geijn, who made fantastic drawings, especially of scenes of witches. We have over a dozen drawings of this type, and some of them are really, really engaging. And has also been, these two are discussed, of course, in this book. And then if we go forward into in the 17th century, you have people like Cornelis Stafleven, David de Nile, David Rijkaard, and Dominicus van Leijmen. All of them explored fantastic imageries, each following his own inclination. In Tania's book, the fascinating works of each of these painters are brought to life, thanks to the careful analysis of their historical setting, the use of literary sources, and of course the artist's modes of expression. Therefore, Tania De Nile's survey of spokerijen in 16th and 17th century Netherlands, this painting offers many stimuli, also for our own fantasy and scholarly curiosity. And the title of today's conference is Into the Magic, Witch Trials and Sorcery Scenes in Early Modern Europe. Tania, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Before I start, I would like to thank Michael Fackelstein and Gert-Jan Andersman for asking us today at the NIKI, which is actually a very special place for me. Actually, you will forgive me if before we embark on dark times and dark topics, I need to emphasize how this place is bright for students and scholars. For my researches, I owe a great deal, especially to Gert-Jan, to his teachings and his incredible generosity of exchange over the many years that I have, that I have been at the Institute, as well as to the warm support of Ilaria Masi and of all the people who work here, lightening the burden of research and making every stay at the NIKI a return to family. So special thanks also to Lex Karl and Matthijs van Voorkum for supporting me in the organization of the conference, in which I will focus on some of the protagonists and themes addressed in my book, Fantasmagorie, Streghe, Demoni e Tentazioni nell'arte fiamminga. Oh, sorry. That's work. Yes, sorry. It's spooky things. Demoni e tentazioni nell'arte fiamminga e olandese del Seicento. And I also want to remember already, Gertian already did, but it was published last year by the editor Officina Libraria and financed with great generosity by the Phoebus Foundation in Antwerp. My book stems from the researches carried out during my PhD, both at the Sapienza in Rome and Leiden Universitair under the guidance of Gertian van der Smaan. And already in my master thesis, I started analyzing the enormous fortune of Jeroen van Achen, better known as Hieronymus Bos in Flemish and Dutch etchings and drawings, as attested by the mass of imitations that invaded the market in Antwerp, in particular throughout the 16th century. I then decided to continue along this path during my PhD, including at that point the 17th century and expanding the research to painting. My research became at a certain point a sort of reaction thesis. That is, I had to demonstrate that what in much of the modern historiography and studies, but also in some recent exhibitions, are called diablerie, and simply interpreted as imitation of the famous models of Jeroen Bos or Peter Bruegel de Helder, were instead a specific thematic category, a specific genre in the Dutch Golden Age. And in what way could I demonstrate? By interrogating what in the second chapter of my book I called the voice of the sources, so la voce delle fonti. The voice not only of the treatise of art literature produced in the Netherlands in the 17th century, but above all the inventories and of collections and of course also auction catalogs. Well, it turned out that in Dutch sources, these representations were called spokerijen, so after spoke from spook, ghosts. And actually the use of this term only in the Protestant northern Netherlands to refer to temptations, witchcraft scenes, and hells implies the perception that beyond the different themes, these representations were assimilable by being ghosts. So things that do not exist, but pretend to exist, just like the devil. Thus, we see actually here the detachment from the original religious metrics, so evident in the episode of the temptation of Saint Anthony, which actually continue to be called tentatien, so temptations, only in the Catholic South. Whereas in the North, the fact that a saint is represented here no longer matters, because this is seen just as a phantasmagoria, to the point that even in this painting by Cornelis Aftelleven I chose for my book's cover, well, the saint does not resist but flees, and the pig, which was his attribute, has become a wild boar at the head of demons. Compared to other themes of the demonic that iconographically have very ancient origins, such as the temptation of St. Anthony narrated in the Vita Antoni, written by Athanasius of Alexandria in the 4th century, or the hells that appear in Final Judgments, of course, one of the much depicted episodes from the Middle Age onwards, witchcraft is instead a new theme in the world of art, and even more so in painting. This is an important distinction, actually, because if it is true that witches' Sabbath already existed in the 16th century engravings, such as the famous Stregozzo by Marcantonio Raimondi, or of course Dürer and Balto Green, in painting we can see from the second quarter of the 16th century just few rare representations of witchy episodes of magic narrated in the sacred texts such as Saul and the Witch of Endor, which comes from the book of Samuel in the Bible, here represented in 1526 by Jacob Cornelis van Opsanen, or the story of the encounter between St. James and the magician Hermogenes, who was later converted by the saint to Christianity, here in one of the two famous prints by Peter Bruegel, edited in 1565 by Hieronymus Koch, in which we find some of the most copied and ubiquitous motifs in all future representation of witches, such as the fireplace here, or for example, the hand of the glory, this dried hand of a condemned man, and witches here, which flying on brooms, actually something that for those of us who are used to Halloween is taken for granted. But instead, until then, the witch's main means of travel was a demonic goat or a dragon. Actually, the publication of Bruegel's engravings in 1565 is related to the fact that precisely between 1560 and 1630, there was a bloody wave of persecution in Central and Western Europe, which was matched by a significant increase in witches' trials. In these decades, the divisions caused by the Protestant Reformation, the political and social quarrels that followed the progressive centralization of powers during the establishment of nation-states, and also, above all, the increase in inequalities between city and country, determine a climate of uncertainty and fear in which culprits must be sought. Add to these, we should not forget the climatic variation and extreme weather events of the so-called Little Ice Age, which caused abnormal snowfall, famine, and death. So the same, for example, witchy, I show you the detail, the same witchy snowfall that we can see in this image, now in this magic window in one of the many witches' kitchens by Francken. This is by Franz Francken, but there are many made by his workshop. So interiors where we can actually see a sort of summary of all the beliefs widespread in numerous treatises about demonology at the time. So the need to find a reassuring explanation for what appeared inexplicable in the eyes of contemporaries made the alleged witches perfect scapegoats, as well as excellent goat cart drivers, as we can see in this wonderful drawing by Jacques de Geen in the Leiden Universitair, but above all, easy targets, since they were mostly elderly and already marginalized women. So the step from scapegoats to demonic goats was very short, as you can see. From what has just been said, it is clear how chronologically precocious is the witchcraft scene by Bartholomew Spranger, quoted in Karel van Mander's Headskilder book. I'll translate, and among other things, he painted an ingenious little witchcraft in a ruin, like a sort of coliseum, where one can see women flying on brooms and similar ghosts in the night, so a nocturnal witchcraft. Well, this witchcraft painted by Spranger during his first sejour in Rome, so around 1566 and 1567, has not reached us, but because of the perfect match with Van Mander's description, I'm firmly convinced that Accent Sabbath in the Phoebus Foundation in Antwerp could perhaps be a direct derivation from Spranger's prototype by an anonymous Flemish painter. This is a very special work because if we exclude the engravings already mentioned at the beginning of my speech, this is the first painted witches' Sabbath detached from religious or mythological episodes, as well as one of the first where witches use brooms to fly in the sky. Van Manders tells that Spranger's little witchcraft scene was painted for the banker Johan Spindolo, that I believe refers perhaps to a member of the Spinola family from Genoa. But since the latter did not want it, it was bought at a high price by the miniaturist Giulio Clovio, who in turn showed it to Cardinal Alessandro Farnese. So the Tovereken became the pièce de réception through which Spranger made himself known and appreciated by the Cardinal, who was so impressed by the work that he invited the artist to be his guest. The banker then regretted rejecting the work, and Francken painted another, always from under, tell us this story, even more beautiful version. So more than one witchcraft scene by Francken circulated at the time, which may have encouraged replications by other artists. Indeed, I could find a reference actually to a Sabbath described as a copy after Francken in the post-mortem inventory of Giovanni Andrea Doria, which was actually the husband of Veronica Spinola, so always a Spinola family, always in Genoa. Well, the Sabbath in the Phoebus Foundation speaks of Rome, not only because of the setting among ancient ruins, because on closer inspection, these witches quote and echo various figures from the vault of the Sistine Chapel, painted by the divine Michelangelo between 1508 and 1512. The witch, with her back to the far right, leading the way to the others, with the torch in her hand, recalls, in my opinion, the figure of God, the Father, depicted in the scene with the creation of the sun, the moon, and the plants. The hooded witch in the left foreground recalls the Persian Sibyl. Finally, the most striking reference is the witch in flight in the very center of the panel, whose forward turn recalls the serpentine form of the Libyan Sibyl. An echo of the Francken prototype can perhaps be also found in an unpublished drawing recorded in Raymond Ruby's collection in Paris in 1965. You can see the group here in the air is exactly the same, the four witches flying in the air. Again, a Colosseum, and again, this setting is not accidental. Tradition is it that magic and necromantic rituals took place inside the Colosseum, as witnessed by Benvenuto Cellini in his autobiography written between 1555 and 1562, but then just published in Cologne in 1728. And he says, "We went to the Colosseum where the priest, dressed as a necromancer, began to draw circles on the ground with the most beautiful ceremony that can be imagined in the world. This lasted more than an hour and a half. Several legends of demons appeared so that the Colosseum was all full of demons." And actually, Cellini's autobiography was written just a few years before Francken's arrival in Rome. So at the time, the Colosseum was a spooky place. It must be said, however, that representation of witchcraft became established in the art market mainly from the very first years of the 17th century, but also that the approach to the specific subjects of the witch hunt varies greatly in early modern Europe, from context to context. And of course, works of art help us to understand these differences. Particularly about the northern Netherlands, namely the 7 united provinces, which from the early 1580s gained independence from the Spanish kingdom and embraced Calvinism, we cannot in this territory the existence of a profound skepticism about the power of witches to generate evil spells. Witchcraft is an insubstantial fiction, as are the smoke and shadow simulating a third witch in this incredible drawing by Jacques de Heijn, made during the period when he left Antwerp, so southern Netherlands, in the early 17th century and moved to the north, so to Leiden. In those years, let's remember that Thomas Basson, which was the father of de Heijn, Brother Gein's brother-in-law, was involved in the Dutch translation of a very important treaty, The Discovery of Witchcraft by Reginald Scott, was published in London in 1584, while the Dutch translation was published under the title Ontdekking van Toverij in 1609. So the text was accompanied by a supplement containing the testimonies of 5 professors, including the rector of the Leiden Universitair, so the oldest university in Holland, who testified during a trial in 1594, trying to prove the scientific groundlessness of the so-called water test, to which alleged witches were subjected on the basis of the idea that they had the power to float. They considered the mental images of bewitched women no longer as product of the direct action of the devil, but simple deceptions of the mind, to be traced back to a state of deep melancholia, no? How modern this thought is. And not by chance, Jacques de Haine always represents witches in the usual pose of the melancholy, with the face resting on the hand, while for the 1610 engraving, as Guy Thales demonstrated, he chooses the less popular melancholic gesture of the 2 hands with the finger crossed. No, you can see here this between them, so like that. In this way, the first steps towards the knowledge of modern psychiatry were thus taken, to the extent that the Dutch priest Jacob van Lyck considers melancholia a disease of the illusion, which makes one believe and do things that do not exist. This skepticism in vogue in the northern Netherlands also seems to underlie a painting only known in this ugly and black and white picture I found in the RKD, in the Hague, a painting that was translated on the antique markets, and we don't know where it is now. And here we can see a woman, perhaps a witch, is here forced to undergo a fire torture and exposed as an ecce homo to the merciless gaze of a male jury and the crowd gathered inside a courtroom where a statue of a blindfolded justice is hosted. But above all, I want to show you this other painting. I discovered during my PhD this painting, and it is in the depots of the Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart, but it was unattributed, and I published it in my book for the first time. So actually, this painting on copper shows a very rare depiction of a public hanging, and in my opinion can be attributed to Franz Francken, or more probably to his circle, his workshop, and thus always to the Antwerp context. We are here in the southern Netherlands, which remained, let's remember, under Spanish and Catholic rules. In this case, the interest in the subject seems to be linked to a climate of general tightening of persecution desired by the Catholic Archdukes Albert and Isabella. And we know, in fact, that in Antwerp, after many decades, on the 22nd of August, 1603, Clara Gussen was publicly executed on the charge of taking part in several Sabbaths riding a broom. On the left side here, we can see the moment of the capture of a man, a sorcerer or heretic, who was preparing to fly to the Sabbath by clasping a crucifix in his hands in a blasphemous gesture. And it is clear that it is a witchcraft scene because it happens under a fireplace, which is very similar, of course, to the model of Peter Bruegel, in which, and here in the painting by Francken, we see also the feet of another figure. So one can see perhaps a figure who manages just in time to slip into the hood and escape. On the right side, we see the subsequent execution in a public square in front of many people. So one can see here the desire to show the public punishment, which denotes a different aim from the one we have seen before in the northern Netherlands. But at the same time, I wonder If the fact that the painter chooses to hide the faces of those capturing the sorcerer and only show his face does not imply that he did not agree with such acts taking place in Antwerp in those years. We continue with our overview on Spanish possessions outwards, where censorship was even worse, and we arrive in the capital of the Spanish viceroyalty in Naples. In the same years of the execution painted by Francken, we have another trial, another accusation of witchcraft, this time against a painter, more specifically a Dutch painter, Jacob van Swanenburg, who came from the northern Netherlands, so from Leiden. Let's remember, this is an important detail, so the city where the professors of the Leiden Universitair and even the burgomaster of the city, which was his father, Isaac van Swanenburg, fought against the abuses of the witch trials. Well, while living in Naples in 1608, Swanenburg was accused by the Holy Office of having exhibited a witchcraft scene in his workshop, which was located, and this is another important detail, near the church of Santa Maria della Carità. And we still have actually the acts of this trial against the painter, and they are very funny, no? To follow also the way he used to defend himself against the accusation of the Inquisitors. So 1608. So the Inquisitors asked him if he had taken part in any Sabbaths to be able to describe so well a witch's conventions in such detail. He says no. And to limit his participation, he says that in reality, he just realized the wish of an unknown gentleman who spoke Italian, so was not a dangerous Calvinist, but was a Catholic, to make a copy of a certain witchcraft scene. It was thought till now that this was just a good excuse, of course, not to escape the accusation of the Inquisitors. Instead, now we know that the artist is not lying when he says that he copied a pre-existing work. His models, which had never been identified until now, is certainly to be found in this flying sheet, referring to events in the Diocese of Trier in 1593, entitled A New Terrible Adventure of Monstrous Demons. So actually all the characters listed by Swanenburg during the deposition appear, in fact, in this etching. For example, for you, so the three witches in flight, of course, Swanenburg speaks Italian during the deposition. He used to live there for 26 years. He had an Italian wife, actually. So actually, we have these three witches in flight. On the right, the witch coming out of the fireplace while another is entering it, exactly like in Bruegel's models and also, of course, in the above-mentioned Francken's execution. In the background, a group of women with torches in their hands following a witch on a dragon. And the two women with Latin torches on skeletons. Now, many other details, but of course, now this is a proof that you can use this as a model. And actually, we notice that most of these figures can also be found in this witchcraft scene, which is now in a private collection, and I think is the only one that surely is by the artist. So we don't have, we know that he painted lots of witchcraft scenes, but this is the only one that, in my opinion, is surely by him. Oh, sorry. Surprise. In addition, what is even more important, Swanenburg provides his explanation to the meaning of such depictions and the reasons why that might drive an artist to paint them. And this is very interesting. Because I imagine to give pleasure to the people who would see it. Because I kept this for a joke and I did it to make people laugh. All the painters like these things because they are fantasy things. So pleasure, joke, something you can laugh, fantasy. Well, it is more than probable that Svanenburg was aware that he was doing something forbidden in Italy, and that there was a real marketing operation in such a transgressive act. But it is also clear from his words that dealing with these subjects pleased and amused both the public and the painters. Especially in the context of the northern Netherlands, witchcraft was just a painting subgenre within the spookerijen, a genre that more than others allowed painters to freely use their imagination. And that's why I think Salvatore Rosa, who was a great defender of freedom in art, loved these subjects and used Svanenburg's witches as models. Phantasmagorias qualify as a space of creative freedom, a timeless necessity that has much in common with those that Giuliano Briganti, in a beautiful book, calls the painter of the imaginary, between the 18th, the romantic era, so 18th and 19th centuries, such as Fuseli and Goya. The spookerijen were a genre in which the comic and demonic sides went hand in hand as manifestation of what one had to laugh at and thus get away from, that upside-down world that the Flemish called the verkeerde wereld. Moreover, the etymology of the French drôle, which means funny, is traced back to droll, terms that in Middle Dutch indicated also the trolls. Now we know this term, so demonic creatures borrowed from the Norse sagas, confirming that the overlapping of the two aspects of the monstrous and the comic was already anything but incoherent. Another rare testimony of a witch execution is this very famous drawing by Anthony van Dyck, on the top of which we can read the inscription Una striga in Palermo, so a witch in Palermo, in Sicily. A sheet now in the British Museum, which comes from Van Dyck's Italian sketchbook. And well, the most important thing is that we know that she sketched afterlife, or we would say Naret Leven. It was estimated that between 1610 and 17, over 5,000 witch trials were conducted by the Spanish Inquisition. Anningsen identifies this woman in the 50-year-old Felipa la Calabria, who was sentenced, we know the exact date, the 19th of May, 1624, close by the church of St. Dominic. We notice that the witch is accompanied by a cloaked man, perhaps a priest or a monk, and she has a penitential costume. She's wearing a tall conical hat decorated with a devil and carrying a long taper, something which has much in common with the costumes of the flagellants in this painting by Peter Faller, dated more or less in the same years, a bit later, but more or less the costume is very, very similar. So actually, it is probably the representation of the so-called auto de fe, meaning act of fate, which was a ritual of public penance and often the final step in the Inquisition process, imposed by the Spanish but also the Portuguese Inquisition, and whose extreme form was death by burning. Marta Schwendener, a few years ago, connected this sketch to the fact that on May 7, so just 12 days before this execution, dated 19th of May, a few weeks after Van Dyck's arrival, the first case of plague was reported in Palermo, and Van Dyck was quarantined. In this case, the execution of this witch from Palermo could be also used as a means by which to obtain from God the cessation of the epidemic, perhaps. What is important to underline is that this drawing, together with the now discovered Francken's painting in Stuttgart, is one of the very few representing in painting witches and heretics' public executions. But well, a very nice landscape. Just to say that things were not better in Switzerland. Herman van Obraken, writing, of course, the lives of the 17th century Dutch artists, writes also the life of Jan Akkert, and dwells on an episode that occurred during the stay of this artist coming from Amsterdam in Schaffhausen in 1653-56 in Switzerland. As we know, he says, Obraken, that he used to make drawings from life while walking through the mountains in an isolated place, like this Swiss landscape now in a private collection, and some locals became very suspicious and not knowing what it was scribbled on this sheet, became convinced that he was a magician. Until one day, they even decided to tie him up and hand him over the bailiff. Knowing the painter well and believing their accusation to be unfounded, the magistrate freed him. But afterwards, whenever he met him, he could not stop laughing, remembering that silly incident. There is another Dutch artist specialized. There is another Dutch artist specialized in sorcery scenes who, in the 1680s in Rome, performed a less courageous but perhaps more effective operation to enter his witchcraft scenes in the Roman art market without problems with the censorship. And I'm speaking about Domenicus van Wijnen, who came from Amsterdam, so again, northern Netherlands. In fact, he only chooses to depict scenes of magic taken from mythology or ancient literature. For example, in this case, for example, I show you an episode in which Medea rejuvenates, thanks to her magical powers, Aeson's, so Jason's father. Well, this is exactly a mirror image operation to the one that Jan Brugge the Helder had carried out 100 years earlier, also in Rome, painting mythological hells that had the appearance of being Flemish, but which instead represented the descent to the underworld described by Virgil in the Aeneid and by Ovid in the Metamorphoses, namely those of Orpheus, Aeneas and the Sibyl and Juno. And here in this famous hell in Palazzo Colonna in Rome, but also in the very similar version in Palazzo Pitti, he also inserts an Italian cameo with Dante and Virgil. On closer inspection, however, what most characterizes the works by Van Wijnen is the fact that they qualify as the Nordic translation of a repertoire of quotations and references to ancient and modern sources viewed by him in Rome. And this aspect is expressly described by his biographer, Jan van Gogh, as the specific schildertrant, so the pictorial style, with which Domenicus earned his living in Italy, working for the market. So let's come closer to Van Wijnen's mythological sorcery scenes. Two of the most significant are the pendants in the Herzog Anton Ulrich Museum in Braunschweig, depicting the soothsayer Tiresias and his daughter Manto. So the episode, recognized by Jan Willem Salomonson, is taken from the Thebaid of Statius and describe the act of necromancy that King Theocles asked to two soothsayers, wishing to question the spirit of the late King Laius about the future fate of the city of Thebes. In the first painting, Tiresia, armed with a magical wand, is intent on materializing the entrance to the underworld, where we see Charon and Tantalus. So the classical setting is here suggested by the presence of the door, decorated in bas-relief, over which a classical bust stands to the right. while behind Charon, we glimpse the arches of an aqueduct. So the position of the soothsayer again echoes Michelangelo, like in the Sabbath in the famous Foundation. And in particular, the pose of the so-called nudi, so the naked in the Sistine Chapel. In turn, the figure in the foreground, holding a large spear on his shoulders, recalls a lot the statues of the Farnese Atlas, and of course also the related painting, always in Palazzo Farnese. While the flying Tisiphon cites the gesture of the arms of Perindel-Vaga's Jupiter in Villa of the Prince in Genoa. Moreover, the classical bust is very similar to the famous Claudius Apotheosis. But the breadth and variety of Van Beinen's sources are also made explicit through the literal quote of the vase decorated with putti, taken from these engravings, a detail of engraving representing Plato's Symposium by Pietro Testa. And quotations from Michelangelo return also independent, and the figure of Hades repeats the gesture of the Server Christ in the Sistine Judgment, while the pose of the goddess Proserpina can be related to the allegorical figures of the tombs of the Medici chapels in Florence. Well, Van Beinen is a rare and exceptional but recognizable painter. And it is here in Florence that you can find the only one of his works still preserved in Italy, today in the depots of Palazzo Pitti. This special painting was first recognized and correctly attributed to Van Beinen by Marco Chiarini in a contribution published in the volume Au 80, edited among others by Gertjan van der Smaan in honor of the former director of the NIKI, Bert Meijer, in 2002, but this attribution has been completely forgotten, so that this painting is still recorded in the museum as anonymous. And these are two pendants. The first you can see, very similar to the one in Palazzo Pitti, were in auction in London in 1988 with a wrong attribution to Salvator Rosa, while they can clearly be included in the corpus of Domenico Van Beinen, whose name was known at the time just by a few specialists and luckily not yet in the art market. On the contrary, in the last 20 years, too many works representing witchcraft in the art market have been attributed to Domenicus, but are not by him, having in no way his style. And I show you here a very quick roundup of them. They are always representation of Sabbath tout court, characterized by overcrowded scenes, men lying down on the ground, other men in armor, young witches and old witches, love spells in a confused bundle of witchcraft cliché. So you see here their characteristics, the recurrence of the motifs, the fact that we can date them all between the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the following one, are all aspects that lead us to reflect to the fact that perhaps, thanks to the witches' wave generated by Salvator Rosa and Van Beinen, witchcraft scenes began to appear on the market and in the Italian collections. So although there are, this is other two examples, so although there are often works of not great value, both artistic and economic, however, they are indicative of a taste for witchcraft that can be seen also in the contemporary Roman inventories, especially from the last quarter of the 17th century. These works in the antique market nowadays end up in the cauldron of the lesser studied till now Domenico Van Beinen, who is a sort of name of convenience, exactly as the generic Bruegel of the Hells, the Hellschen Bruegel, now Bruegel degli Inferni, was in the old inventories. But the study of the Italian inventories make us understand that despite the censorship, witchcraft scenes spread widely in the 17th century Italy, but also how much the historiography and the art market have often limited themselves to repeat the same names traditionally linked to the witchcraft production, without being able to grasp the complexity of an artistic genre made up of mutual exchanges between cultures, in this case Dutch, Flemish, and Italian, figurative contexts. In my book, I have tried to make evident the variety of the forgotten genre of the Spokerian by tracing its origins and developments and reconstructing a large repertoire of works, featuring not only well-known artists and big names. This is why I have chosen to give great importance to the illustrative set, which aims to make evident borrowings and contaminations between Nordic and Italian artistic cultures. An aspect that of the circulation of motifs, which was very much very present and very important in Eugenio Battisti's Antirinascimento, published in 1962, which was of great inspiration to me, above all in understanding that this subject necessarily required a multidisciplinary approach and dialogue, touching on themes that also involved the history of religions, folklore, anthropology, the history of philosophy, and more generally, the history of ideas. Well, the book Fantasmagorie, which you can browse if you want, it is available also in the NIKI library, owes a great deal to the publishing house Officina Libraia. So I really want to thank Marco Jelinek and Paola Gallerani for the care and the attention. But I really want to say a special thanks to Monica Fintoni for her extraordinary proofreading work, and also Andrea Paoletti. And of course, I want to remember again the generosity of the Famous Foundation, as I already tell you, which financed the publication. And finally, I really thank all of you who, fortunately, were not able to resist the demonic temptation to be here today in presence and online. So thank you very much for your attention.